Welcome to the Nonprofit Edge, a podcast series to promote purpose in practice. Each week, this webinar series features an extraordinary individual that provides valuable and impactful services, helping to transform the capabilities of their nonprofit clients. Join us as we explore a variety of topics, all vital to the success of nonprofit organizations. Learn and grow from the experience and expertise of our featured guests. Without further delay, let's introduce you to the host of the Nonprofit Edge podcast series, Chris Looney.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Edge, where we explore the leadership, governance, and strategic decisions that shape strong, sustainable nonprofit organizations. In each episode, we're designed to give CEOs, directors, senior leaders practical insight that they can use right away, even in areas that feel complex or intimidating. Today's conversation focuses on a topic that many nonprofit leaders find challenging but unavoidable, and that's how to approach a search for investment counsel in a thoughtful, disciplined way that protects the mission and strengthens governance. Joining me today is Michael Skillman, Managing Director of Institutional Consulting at Beacon Pointe Advisors. Michael works extensively with nonprofit organizations, helping executive leaders and boards navigate investment governance, advisor selection, and the long-term stewardship of assets. And what makes Michael's perspective especially valuable today is that he truly sits on both sides of the table. In addition to his professional consultancy, he serves as vice chair of the board for Memorial Care, where he also chairs the investment committee, and is a board member of the Saddleback Memorial Center Foundation. Because Michael currently carries the fiduciary weight of a board leader, he understands that governance isn't just a technical exercise, it's a deeply personal commitment to a mission, and he has a unique ability to translate complex investment concepts into clear, practical guidance for leaders who are not investment experts. His focus is not just on portfolios, but on the decision-making and alignment required to protect an organization's mission over the long term. So welcome to the show, Mike. Thanks for joining.
Chris, thanks for having me. And, thanks for what you're doing to pour into the nonprofit leadership world. I know it's a resource that's much needed, and, really appreciate what you're doing for the whole community.
You bet. You bet. Well, it's a passion for both of us, I know. It's a ministry for both of us, I know. And I'm excited to jump into this topic, one that we haven't touched on before. So let's jump in and try to get the audience aware of all the things that they need to know in this particular realm. So let's start by framing this sort of challenge that we have. Mike, you point out that most nonprofits do not necessarily proactively plan an investment search. They react to stress, turnover, or outside recommendations. Why is this such a common pattern, and why does it make these decisions harder than they need to be?
Well, I think it's a common pattern to be reactive because the focus of the mission is just that, running the day-to-day mission and development fundraising, and the money is there for the mission. But if all is going well, there's really not a lot of pressure to be doing things differently. So it's usually driven by, number one, a market downturn, which of course we haven't had in a little while, board turnover or turnover on the advisors team. Sometimes you get donor influence. You get an important donor that has very strong investment opinions, and they want to make changes or start pushing the executive directors to feel like they should be doing something differently. And so that leads quite often to well, we better open this up and take a look at what we're doing.
Yeah, that's all real scenarios that I've experienced before, and all of a sudden it's an emergency or the thing's on fire, so you have to respond. I get that. Well, what are the risks that nonprofits face when they make investment decisions in stressful moments?
Well, I think your little metaphor that our fire is a good one, because we don't want to be putting out fires. We want to be the fire marshal and planning on how to have them.
Yeah,
So
good.
thinking about that ahead of time is important. And I think the biggest risk isn't necessarily of your investments underperforming, and whether that's a benchmark or what your goals are. It's that typically when risk is high, emotions are high, and you don't always make the most logical decision. And it's expensive to change. And then it takes a while to validate whether your new advisor is really doing a good job. So I think it's very good to stop, be intentional, have a plan for moving forward instead of just responding to crisis. And if you have to respond to crisis, because they do happen, then having a plan and clarifying roles and what the goals are helps you navigate that crisis more effectively.
No, that's great. You emphasize that leaders should start by understanding the role assets play in the mission. How should nonprofit leaders think differently about endowments, reserves, and operating capital?
Yeah, I think we take this for granted sometimes. Like, well, of course we know what the money's for. It's to fund our mission. And quite often we will bucket the pools of assets into, short term for operating capital, maybe intermediate term for the next few years, and that can be invested differently. And then really the long term, which we like to call the endowment or forever growth part of the pool. So I think if you segment what the goals are of each pool of money, you can then construct an investment program that really optimizes for meeting those goals for each of the different needs. So many do this, but it's kind of surprising to me sometimes how many organizations haven't really thought about what the goal is for each segment of the money so that they can be investing, to meet those goals.
Yeah. And I have to believe that the vast majority of nonprofits out there aren't lucky enough to sort of have the long-term assets that need to be managed, something that they aspire to have and want to have and should be positioning themselves to have through their gift planning efforts and whatnot. But you're absolutely right. Those that are fortunate to have the longer term assets and the shorter term assets do need to really carefully understand what those are, bucket those appropriately.
Yeah. And look, every organization, you're right. It's just we're trying to take in enough every year to meet our current needs. And the aspirational model is to move to that, kind of three bucket approach. And even if the endowment piece is a small piece, beginning early and putting something there for future years so it's not so dependent on year to year development. I know is everyone's goal, and it's much easier said than done. But, if you don't plan for it, it never will happen, right? So.
I think that's a wonderful thing to say. If you don't plan for it, it's not gonna ever happen. And it doesn't take a lot of effort to move in the direction toward planning for assets that are more long-term endowment type assets.
Yeah,
So, how does clarity around growth or stability or sustainability change the kind of advisor a nonprofit should be looking for?
Well, you should look for an advisor that understands it's about constructing an investment program that's there to meet those goals and minimize the risk that you don't meet them. And okay, well, that sounds pretty basic. What do you mean by that? I think often because it can be emotional and investing money can be emotional and different, as I said earlier, board members, donors have influence. Sometimes they're looking just for folks that have generated the greatest return over the most recent period of time, whatever that most recent period is.
Right.
They're looking for that star picker. Yeah, the way we approach it, and I think, there's other that do it well, is it's really about planning for what the long-term needs are and long-term rates of return will drive that. And then managing risk around meeting that goal. So it's not about producing the best return every year. It's understanding what your long-term goals are, constructing a diversified investment program that has the best chances to meet that goal. And so you're not swinging for the fences every year. You're really trying to minimize the risk that long-term you're not going to meet that goal. So it starts with a good solid investment policy statement, constructing asset allocation, and then just being very thoughtful on the kind of investments and managers that manage those investments that construct that diversified portfolio.
Yeah. And a place like Beacon Pointe has the capacity to pivot through all of these different types of investments, right? Short term, medium, long term. So you're a one-stop shop, and I imagine it's helpful for a nonprofit, unless they're investing billions of dollars and have to diversify their exposure to different agencies. The typical nonprofit probably would benefit from having one solid advisor like you who can handle the variety of different investment types, right?
Our business model is open architecture. So we're really the quarterback, that one-stop shop to manage the relationship, guide the policy statement, manage the overall portfolio. But all of our underlying investments are managed by outside, managers and funds, so that we give our clients access to that broad array of managers out there, depending on small, medium, or large clients. But we have that full open architecture. They're not forced to just use what we do. So not to be a commercial about what Beacon Pointe does, but I think that is important when directors and their investment committees are looking at advisors, is look for objective advice, transparency on fees, and that open architecture, that they're not just forced to use a single provider's investment offerings.
Well, it's a good point, because some of those investment banks, the big names that people have their money with, might be offering their own internal investment advisors
Exactly.
to put together portfolios, and you're, I guess, able to be a little more flexible, maybe, or search out who would be the best fit for them.
Yeah, the best in class, and we're not earning, a double layer of fees on that. So we're very transparent about
Right.
all those relationships. And whether it's Beacon Point or others, I think those are just important questions to ask, so that there is that transparency. Even if there is, the term we use is proprietary product, that you understand that and make sure that, the all-in fees are well documented and known. And there are organizations that have that and do, are quite transparent. But I think there's quite a lot that aren't. So I think it's gotten a bad name. So I think it's just that classic buyer beware of the kind of strategies that are being offered by the advisor you're interviewing.
Yeah, that's very good. And I think it's always interesting when you think about those board members and others who are like, well, the market's up 15%, but our return is only 8%, and not thinking about the sort of the reality that the goal for at least part of this endowment is to produce predictable income upon which you can sort of run certain programs or fund operations. And so you can't afford to have the risk profile of a 15% return, because a lot of the portfolio needs to be invested in income producing assets, right? And so it's real. I say it because it's so common for me to be in a boardroom where it's like, well, the market's up. Why are we so conservative, or why is our return so low?
Yeah, we could have a psychologist here and get down the behavioral finance discussion, because it's that fear of missing out, and those are the classic boardroom conversations that happen. That's why it's so important to have the overall long-term goals in mind. 5% spending plus inflation, and be able to produce that year in and year out, so there is not great variability about the great programs and the mission of the organization. So we're constantly harping on long-term goals, what risk parameters, and managing that risk, so that in any one year you don't have, well, it might be great to use your numbers to be up 15%. And, given the way the markets have performed the last several years, a handful of stocks producing a lot of the market returns, that mythical conversation you outlined a minute ago is a real one. That happens a lot right now. So it's really about reminding folks of that long-term goal. You're diversified for a reason. It's for that year-to-year consistency.
Yeah. No, that's great. I totally get it. And it points out the need for a well-defined, documented policy that you can constantly point to and say, this is our guidepost. This is how we invest based on this policy. And it's not some chasing the market policy. Our policy is not to equal or better the returns that are achieved in the market. It is to create this very specific diversified portfolio that achieves a certain percentage of return every year for our programs, right? So
absolutely, that governance and investment policy statements, that's really what, the committees and board members are fiduciaries, and for the executive directors and other staff, everyone then can have a common playbook and really protect each other from themselves sometimes, or from maybe a loud board member or donor that really is veering off what the stated long-term plan is. So I can't emphasize enough what you said, how important that is from the governance perspective to have those policies in place.
Yeah. Yeah. And you think, well, that would never happen. Well, it happens every day.
Absolutely.
Every day. Well, one of the foundational questions you raise is about who actually owns investment decisions. Where do you most often see confusion between boards, committees, and staff?
Yeah, I think it's the lack of what we just talked about, establishing that in the governance policy of, say, an investment committee. Now, again, sometimes these documents are different, as appropriate for different size organizations. So I understand that, but there's no reason, no matter what the size of your organization, that you can't have well delineated roles for the board. The investment committee is typically a subcommittee by default of the board, so there should be well documented roles and responsibilities for that committee. And then the investment policy statement. So all of those should be harmonized, so that typically the person on the staff of the organization, whether that's the financial person, the executive director themselves, is the one interacting with the investment committee, but most often, I would say, they're the ones that control that investment decision, and then it's ratified by the board. There's personalities that come into play, as we've talked about, maybe at a board level questioning things, but I think that's the structure that is most common, but also works best. You've got a committee that's typically made up of board members that have specialized expertise. They come from the industry. They perhaps sit on other investment committees elsewhere, and they're the ones that can really monitor that investment program most effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. It is fascinating to me that you often have a committee in the investment world for an organization that is filled with, let's say, experts. They're in the industry, perhaps. They're not just well-meaning people necessarily, like you would have more frequently in a marketing and communications committee or an events committee. You are often probably working with more experts in your work. And that's a challenge too, because they probably feel like
you read my mind. It cuts both ways.
It cuts both ways, and so for me, in my consulting days, when I would come in to work with a development committee, I maybe there was someone that worked in development, but they didn't necessarily have a specialty in campaigns or something. But you come in to work with an investment committee, and they might be the chairman of Goldman Sachs or something, and it cuts both ways. It's just hilarious.
It does. I can poke fun given my memorial care role at doctors. But there's an old joke, the difference between a portfolio manager and a doctor. A portfolio manager doesn't think he can be a doctor.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
So you do, and you'll have, you'll have donors because of their prominence and their role in supporting the organization that may have personal financial resources they oversee, but not be an investment expert, just to speak plainly, yet they have strong opinions. So yes, it's like I said before, we need a psychologist because it does come down to behavioral finance at the end of the day.
Yeah. And you struck a chord with me there, because I remember, coming out of college, I worked in the financial services industry, and I don't know if I ever found a more willing audience than doctors to talk about stocks and investments. Very funny, very funny. Well, let's speak to executive directors out there, and let's say they need to go after a search process to find an investment advisor. What are those practical steps that an executive director should take before even, sort of calling on an investment advisor like you?
So I think the first step in the process is clarifying what the goals and objectives are. Usually it's you're leaving somebody else, and so you just you want to run away from them sometimes. So
Yeah.
I think it's important to clearly define what you want to run to. It's almost analogous to a job search. Sometimes once someone wants to leave their old company so bad, they don't
Yeah.
think carefully about what they're running to. So I think having a game plan of what's most important in terms of the type of organization, the breadth of advice they can give. Can they help with development? Can they meet with donors? Can they do things beyond just investment expertise that may be very relevant and important to your organization? So, having a well thought out plan, whether it's I find it's helpful to have a subcommittee of the investment committee that would work with an executive director or a CFO, depending on the organization internally, to come up with that game plan of what's most important to us. What size organization? Does it matter if they're local? Really defining that criteria ahead of time. A lot of times, the big name firms get overweighted because there's a belief that, there's safety there. But, many times, I like to say, there's the performance of an investment advisor can be inversely correlated to their size. So sometimes smaller organizations are more nimble and have better performance. It's the same thing about the complexity of the investment program. Just, complexity using illiquid alternatives may be appropriate for large organizations that have the luxury of having long-term endowment style pools, but quite often that doesn't fit for many. So, don't be mesmerized by how complex an advisor comes in and talks about the breadth of their capabilities. It has to fit right for you. So I think that's where coming in with a plan of what's most important ahead of doing the search will serve people best. There's also a new cottage industry that has developed where there are specific consultants that help nonprofits conduct a search for a new investment advisor.
I see. Yeah.
The new acronym is Outsourced Chief Investment Officer for what we do. I mean, we still call ourselves consultants, but if we've been delegated the full authority to make decisions around investing for the nonprofit, the industry is never lacking for acronyms. So OCIO, your audience may have heard that term before. So that's just a fancy way of saying you've given the advisor full discretion, and it's increasingly popular for nonprofits now because you are relying on volunteer boards that meet quarterly. They just don't have the time or resources, and certainly staff doesn't to make decisions about investments, in between meetings. So you've seen that as a much more common way for nonprofits to invest, is having that full discretion to their investment advisor.
Okay, so that's one option, which I can understand, but you were talking about another layer of individual on top of that, kind of like a owner's rep in a construction project, right?
Good analogy. Yeah, exactly.
The manager.
Yeah, so they call themselves OCIO, search consultants. So, we have a list of who those people are. I'm happy to share that. And, there's many committees or nonprofits, they feel, no, well, that's just another layer of fees. We have enough expertise. We don't need to spend that. But if there is anxiety that we don't have a committee or board that's comfortable with that, the executive director or CFO, certainly don't have time or expertise, then there are other folks out there that can help navigate that process. So I just wanted to make everyone aware of that.
You need someone that is going to go toe to toe with that very loud board member who just won't relent on their opinions about not investing in this or investing in that, right? So putting I don't know, distance between you and danger by inserting another expert, which I see value in sometimes as well. I think it's interesting to sort of have these owners reps in these different arenas that, certainly in construction, when you talk about the value engineering, the savings that can accrue when you have an expert that's, not over ordering or not over whatever, I can understand.
Yeah, there's definitely value there. They're doing these searches for other clients. They know who the players are. So again, it's not right for everyone because it's not an inconsequential additional layer of fees, but it can be a right fit for organizations that really want that kind of help that you described.
Yeah, and sometimes we have to remember too that the frame that some of us have might be for a $1 million or less account, but there are actually accounts that have billions of dollars in them that are being managed. And the level of sophistication can be very, very high, right?
Right, exactly. So we're kind of addressing everyone here, and you understand there is a range of sophistication and often correlated with the size of the portfolio.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we've talked a little bit about that definition of success, having that sort of be clear from the get-go, and that being a nice guide to helping the investment advisor, but also the organization understand what it is that the goal is here. Is sort of like, what are these terms that are really important in this process? There's predictability, liquidity, transparency. There's all kinds of words and language that
Yeah.
would be often used. And what are some of the things that I think maybe these nonprofit leaders need to know about the terms they should be using?
Yes, and often I think folks in our seat don't speak in plain English that everyone can understand. And
Yeah.
so it's important that on our side of the table, we're making sure we're constantly challenging ourselves to do just that, of course. But if you don't feel like the people you're interviewing or your current advisor are speaking that plain English that makes sense to everyone, really call them out for that. Don't, I think there's a natural human tendency of like, well, maybe I don't understand it, so I don't want to challenge them. And there's no reason for that. Just make sure that those terms are being explained. So when we talk about, predictability, you mentioned it earlier, we want to have it's nice to have a 15% return like everybody, you see in the markets. But if our goal is 5% plus inflation, that 8% predictable return, so we can make predictable grants every year, meet our obligations, that, I think that predictability might speak for itself, but that year-to-year predictability. And then liquidity is, a lot of investments, private equity, other real estate investments that, again, some larger groups may have, but others may not. It's because of liquidity. You need that cash available to
Right.
make those payments, grants, salaries, all the operational needs. And then when I hear transparency, I think was the other term we used. It's really going back to what we talked about earlier, where if it's open architecture, it's not open architecture, that transparency about what investments your advisor may be managing internally. They're charging you one fee for the overall relationship, but if they're using, it could be even as simple as a money market fund, but they're still making something off of that if it's their own fund. So again, if it's fully disclosed and everyone understands, it's like, well, we got to pay firm, ABC, 5 basis points to manage a money market, or we can pay you the same and you do a good job. That's fine. But if we're charging you a lot of money and not telling you that, and you find out after the fact, and I've had that experience, will not mention any names, as a committee member, then it leads to really a lack of trust, and it obviously leads to potentially overpaying. But I think the more damaging outcome is it leads to a lack of trust, and you really need to. At the end of the day, the most important thing about your relationship with your advisor is that you have that trust.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you have the trust, and they're following through to be trustworthy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like, I think it's interesting because all of us have been trusting in our relationships, and we thought that it was a trusting relationship, but come to find out that our trust was one way. I mean, they were trusting us to not pay attention, and so cautionary tale. This is why investment committees have to be aware, have to be paying attention, have to be looking at the actual
The reporting,
the reporting, the monthly summaries.
Yeah, it's the old Ronald Reagan quote of trust but verify.
Trust but verify. Yeah, exactly. That's good. That's a great way to frame the relationship with any advisor that you're going to be spending a lot of money on. And there's so much at stake. There's just so much.
Yeah, not blind trust at all. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. And you talk about governance and policy coming way before the sort of hiring of any firm. Why is the investment policy statement so critical, especially sort of during board transitions or market volatility?
Well, it's really that governance shield, and I use that word because it really protects the organization. It protects the staff, because when markets decline, emotions rise,
Mm.
people start questioning why have we invested in a certain way. Again, that can be coming from the donor side, board side. It really helps ensures the continuity of strategy so that, when you have those inevitable times and you're following your process, then you can point, look, in the long term, the process works. We don't want to just question a short-term outcome. Look at 2022, for example, even back to 2020. In COVID, we had a fast down year. Things came back. 2022, interest rates started to rise because the Fed was raising rates. The markets went down. Now they've come back up. And if you're responding emotionally to those kind of downturns and not following your policy, then you're going to get whipsawed. And so that's really why it really matters for that long-term consistency, that you follow that investment policy statement and review it. I think it's important. That's
Mm,
we track the last review dates for our investment policy statement. So we have a dashboard that will, I know that sounds simple, but it makes sure that we're regularly reviewing those with our clients. And this
what's
is
the
just,
normal length
um,
of
yeah, I
time?
would say at least every 2 years.
Okay. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not every 6 months. It's not every.
No, no. Every 6 months, then you're probably tinkering too much. It's
Right.
sort of like, one of the maybe the worst things that happened about the advent of the 401k plan is you could see it every day. And, the more you look at it, the more you want to tinker with it. And
Sure.
as we both know, that's not the best strategy. So I think having an appropriate review period of 2 years, there's no magic to that. It could be every three, but, certainly you wouldn't want to do it any more than every 5 years. But I think
Good.
2 years is a good benchmark.
Yeah. Well, what are the common misconceptions nonprofit leaders have about their own investment policies? That they don't know what it says?
Yeah, well, I think there's I don't know if it's misconception, but there's probably a tendency to veer away and not hold yourself accountable to it. I mean, we in terms of just how the assets are allocated between longer term, stocks, bonds, just the basic asset classes. We have a display that shows typically every quarter, where are you? Are you in policy range? So if your advisor's not doing that, ask them to, so you don't have to do that internally. So I think that may be one of the most common shortcomings is you're just not regularly checking yourselves against that policy. I know that sounds basic, but it's, everyone gets busy and so you want to hold yourselves accountable there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, with the market the way it is, I imagine rebalancing is necessary because a certain asset class grows disproportionately or declines disproportionately to others. How often does the rebalancing of a portfolio happen?
So instead of time, we look at it more in terms of what is the range of each part of the portfolio and what are the tolerance bands around that, and that can be different for each client. And so if you get market movements that happen, just evolutionary through time, the U.S. stock market outperforms everything. It's almost like the lobster boiling. You don't, it happens over a long period of time. You don't even see it. By hitting those targets and thresholds that forces you to rebalance. You can have much shorter term in the April timeframe of last year. All the concern about tariffs caused a sharp downdraft in the U.S. stock market, and so we were proactive with our clients about rebalancing because it did happen in such a short period of time. So when you have the targets, then you can respond to the market movements just versus a methodical quarterly rebalance period. So I
Okay.
favor more that approach than just the passage of time.
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. When nonprofits do run searches, they often focus on past performance, right? But we know past performance is not an indicator of future. Yeah.
Yeah.
But past performance or brand recognition, right?
Yeah.
We're so easy to sort of satisfy with those two areas. But
Yeah.
why are those sort of signals misleading?
It's hard because all we have to look at is your past performance. If you were picking a new rookie, baseball player, you'd look at this, his or her stats, and it's
Right.
so it's important to look. It's not that it's unimportant. It just has to be put in the right context.
Yeah.
Even simple questions. Okay, was that performance generated by the people that are still there today, or was that a different team that's now moved on, retired?
I'm so glad you said that. Yeah.
Yeah, sold the business. So I think it's more about just putting that past performance in the right context, or the simple notion of, okay, how much risk did they take to get that performance? And that may sound basic for some, but I can, just putting it on
No.
that risk return spectrum so it puts it in the right perspective
So
is important. So again, not unimportant to look at, but just putting the right perspective. I think I touched on the quote biggest names and safety, and you go through periods like the global financial crisis. Kind of hard to believe that was 17 years ago, but I understand you want to trust that your firm's going to be here tomorrow. And so, again, not unimportant, but I think, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes the largest firms can have an inverse correlation to their performance because they're so big. They just want to protect the brand. They're not really worried about generating great performance to stand out from the crowd. They just don't want to lose the clients they have. So quite often they don't have the best performance any longer. That's not an absolute, but it certainly can be out there. So not to say big firms can't be good, but there's just not an automatic that they're the best fit. The same thing
right.
around the comment I made earlier on the complexity of their service offerings.
Yeah, and you have that, oh, you're so big and we're so small. Why would you even want us? Or you're not even going to pay attention to us because
Yeah,
we're nothing to you. We're
right.
not a billion-dollar pension fund. We're just $1 million endowment. Are we going to get the attention that we need? There's all kinds of
Understanding that trade-off. So yes, you want to understand your advisor is going to be around tomorrow, has the resources to hire the best people to serve you, but it is that trade-off. And I think the other important thing in this context is that for most organizations that'll be hired as an advisor, the custody of the assets will be held at an independent bank or an organization like a Charles Schwab, a Fidelity, or a U.S. bank. So remember, if you hire a smaller advisor, it doesn't mean that the advisor is holding onto your assets and they could disappear overnight either. So there is another layer of protection around how those assets are placed in custody.
that's
That's
which
an
is
important
which is
consideration.
different though if you were to kind of go to a big bank and have them internally manage, right? They're going to
Yeah,
hold the asset, they're going to
correct.
potentially have their own managers managing the money and they might invest in their own products, right? But you're talking
Yeah.
about where you are
Independent.
independent, you're going to find an institution to hold the money, and then you're going to
Fine.
find investment advisors to manage that money within that institution.
Exactly. Exactly. So
Interesting.
everyone has their role, and we are the quarterback, if you will. So we're making sure all the right players are on the field.
And do you have a lot of flexibility in terms of the different financial institutions that you can work with?
Yes, we have a very large platform. We have a wealth management side of our business as well as the institutional side, and we employ that institutional approach on both sides. But because of the critical mass, we have $60 billion in assets. So we have, given the nature of that client base, we have a very large breadth of offering for the different types of investment managers we use from the public markets all the way through alternatives where they're appropriate.
Okay, got it. Thank you. So, what are the questions that organizations should be asking you or asking prospective investment advisors? Like, if when you're sitting on this committee for Memorial Care, or what are the questions you ask? What are the questions that need to be asked of investment advisors to really make the best choice?
And this is where planning helps to come up with those questions. Talking about the firm's investment philosophy of how they first start with helping you with your investment policy, how they philosophically view the asset allocation process, their risk management process. I think often we want to hear about how you select an investment manager, and we found this great star who was up, 25% a year for 5 years, but they don't talk about risk management, and that's again, not to be a commercial on Beacon Pointe, but that's one of our differentiators is we take that institutional approach. Our investment team are all institutional investment folks that have managed money to a benchmark in the past. And so it's very much about understanding you put a diversified portfolio together, but manage the risk around that benchmark. So just questioning anyone you talk to about that philosophy and how they structure the portfolio, how they deal with underperformance, how they deal with rebalancing. I think those are all important questions, how they're going to meet with you and service you, and will they help you do ancillary duties like helping to raise money, whether that's meeting with donors, sponsoring your golf tournament that you have,
Right.
and just how are they going to engage with your community beyond just, overseeing the investments.
That's great. Yeah. A little pre-planning is your advice. Is really helpful. And you just laid out 10 questions that should be on that list, and there are probably others. What are
And
the
I've got
clear? Yeah,
oh,
go ahead.
Chris, sorry, I've got a checklist of questions that I've put together, and I'd be happy to share that with the community, and to you and the community afterwards, so we can
Yeah,
put it
no,
in a
that's
link.
great. So people that are listening, just direct message on YouTube or get in touch with us through email, which is connected to our podcast. So you reach out to us, we'll send that along to you for sure. What are the clearest red flags for nonprofits that they should be looking for when they're doing this search?
Um, they're not to sound cheeky about it, but when someone is overly promissory about their investment results, when they're using a lot of jargon and being a bit condescending. Again, I've seen this happen plenty of times. The fact that, that here's our one size and it fits all. I think those are clear warnings that, this is an advisor that's going to really customize and think about our needs.
Yeah.
If they talk about their experience and it's all, dealing with public defined benefit pension plans and they don't really understand how nonprofits work, those may be obvious. You maybe not even be interviewing a firm that fell into that category, but, making sure that their business aligns with the nonprofit world, I guess is maybe the more direct way to say it.
Yeah, no, it's great. And once you've selected your advisor, what does a healthy long-term relationship really look like?
I mean, I think the key word is it really should be a partnership where you feel like that advisor is on the same side of the table. We're there in that role really to protect the mission of the organization. That's why the portfolio is there. So yes, we are protecting the portfolio, but it really, should be that partnership. It's all about the mission. Advisors should be there for ongoing education to the committee and board, transparent and frequent communication. Feels like an extension of the staff is really our goal. If a client said, we feel like your team is an extension of our team and really, takes that burden off of us, I mean, that would just be music to my ears. So I think those are the kind of relationships you want to have where you really feel like you're working with each other hand in glove.
Yeah, no, that's great. And is there an element of education to the work that you do with boards? I mean, do you see that as your responsibility to provide education, or is that just something that needs to be requested of you? How does that work?
Oh, no, it's absolutely our responsibility to be asking the right questions to gauge, what is needed. I mean, you mentioned earlier, some committees have very deep investment experience, so education may look different. It may be more education around why it's important to have an investment policy statement review versus education on private markets. So it really is committee dependent, but it's absolutely incumbent upon us as the advisor or any advisor to be initiating that conversation with the client. And we try and do, we have quarterly webinars around our investment outlook. Our chief investment officer, Michael Dow, leads that. That's a form of education, but, we'll have very specific client centric education seminars, whether that's in person or it could be over Zoom for committee members.
Yeah, I'm kind of smirking because I think about the boardroom where the audit was just reviewed, or the financials were just reviewed, or the investment results are just reviewed. And the question, anybody have any questions? And there are just no questions,
Yeah.
just crickets. And I think it's just 20, 30, 40 people sitting around being like, I have not the foggiest idea what anyone just said, which is a real challenge in the boardroom where people don't know or feel intimidated or scared to ask. And ideally, investment advisors, auditors, et cetera, they can approach it in a way that's going to invite questions without that fear of being caught in some, moment where they don't know the answer or whatever. I mean, it's interesting to think about it that way.
Oh, no, absolutely. And, that's a good, challenge, as I think about myself, make sure I'm starting meetings with that open invitation to ask questions and pause at any time. I mean, they sound like basics that we've all gotten used to, but quite often we sort of jump in and assume everyone knows what they're doing. And we can talk about it here on a podcast, and then we might not want a video camera on ourselves conducting a meeting where we forgot to do that. So I think that's a good reminder to myself included.
Of course. And
Yeah.
it's extra for the advisor that's providing some service, whether it's you or the auditor or whatever, because quite honestly, we're all pretty excited when we make a presentation. We feel like we did a good job and there are no questions and we can go on with our lives and, and not have to sort of sweat, right?
Yeah.
Or answer difficult questions. But, in fairness, I think most of the time there are those questions and the board members just like shaking in their boots, like, I don't want to sound stupid, that kind of thing. So.
Yeah. The old adage, there's no stupid questions. Well, actually there are, but no, people should feel comfortable to ask whatever they want and get them.
Yeah. And I would love to believe that there would be that environment. And this is not your responsibility, but it's the leader of the organization's responsibility to create that environment, which makes it easy for board members to ask their questions and feel heard, right? Yeah.
100%.
All right. So closing kind of takeaway for an executive director listening today who expects they may be running an investment search within the next year or so. What's the very first step you would recommend they take?
I just would say get clarity around the why you're conducting this search so that you can make an action plan that talks about the what and the how and when. And so that's all got to tie into, the mission and governance structure of the organization. But I think important to have that action plan. You mentioned almost a metaphor of building a house with the owner's rep. And I think treat it the same way. You wouldn't build a house without a blueprint. Don't start a search without an action plan. Clarity beats complexity every time. So I think, a good plan, plan your work and work your plan, whatever all those adages we've been, hammered into us over the years, but they're there for a reason because it works.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Mike, thank you for helping demystify what can feel like an overwhelming process for nonprofit leaders, and your emphasis on clarity, governance, alignment reinforces an important message. You don't need to be an investment expert to lead this work well. To our listeners, we hope today's conversation equips you with confidence to approach investment decisions with discipline, intention, and a clear focus on protecting and advancing your mission. If this episode resonated with you, be sure to subscribe to the Nonprofit Edge. And there are other podcasts that we would invite you to check out, Lead for Good and Mastering Fundraising as well, where we explore conversations around really heavy, important topics that impact nonprofit leaders with experts in their field. And so thank you again, Mike, for joining us. Thank you all for being a part of the podcast. And until next time, continue to lead for good.
Thank you for joining us for the Nonprofit Edge, a podcast series to promote purpose in practice. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation and learned some important lessons from our featured expert. We always want our content to be informative and to position nonprofit leaders to succeed. Please join us again for our next podcast. In the meantime, we wish you all the best and encourage you to learn more about Fulcrum Nonprofit Leadership by visiting our website at www.fulcrumleader.com.